43 questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Are Australia's annual carbon emissions higher or lower today than they were when the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government took office?
The Minister for Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. I'd like to inform the House that Australia is currently in its 28th year of economic growth, and emissions per capita,
Members on my left,
and emissions in capita,
members on
and
both
emissions
sides.
intensity of the economy is the lowest
Can the
in 29
minister
years.
just pause? Minister, just pause for a second. He doesn't need to resume his seat. I'm not asking. No, he doesn't. Does not. Just it won't take that long. Just going to say to members on both sides, members expect me to be listening to the answer. It's a bit hard when they're bellowing already. As I've said before, it's like reading yesterday's Hansard every day. The member for Moreton is warned. The minister has the call.
So, thank you, Mr Speaker. As I was saying, the lowest level of emissions per capita in 29 years, Mr Speaker, and the lowest level of emissions intensity in 29 years. Now, Mr Speaker, our electricity sector emissions are down 6.5 million tonnes on the year to December 2018, and we've seen during that year, Mr Speaker, the highest level of renewable investment in the world, Mr Speaker, double the next country in the world. And we are on target, Mr Speaker, we are on target to exceed our Kyoto obligations for 2020 by 367 million tonnes.
The minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, indeed, Mr Speaker. It was a very specific question. It goes to annual carbon emissions. Are they higher, that's up, or lower, that's down?
The Leader of the
Under
Opposition
your government
will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister will cease interjecting. I haven't. No, you're not thanking me for anything. I haven't called you. I'm just going to say to the Leader of the Opposition, you've made your point of order, and I'm going to say to the Leader of the Opposition, I'm obviously listening very carefully, and the minister is still on the topic of the question. He may not be answering it in the way the Leader of the Opposition wants, but you cannot demand that the minister give certain figures that are being asked for. But I'm going to keep listening to the minister and obviously point out to him he needs to be relevant to the question, and I'll call the minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And as I said, our emissions are down per capita at the lowest level for 29 years. Our electricity sector emissions have fallen 6.5 million tonnes over the course of the year. And through our $3.5 billion climate solutions package, Mr Speaker, we will see us achieve the remaining 328 million tonnes of abatement that need to be achieved to reach our 2030 target, having exceeded our 2020 Kyoto target by 328 million tonnes, Mr Speaker. But not only are we meeting our international commitments, we're also making substantial contributions to reducing the emissions of other countries. And we're doing that, Mr Speaker, through the record growth in our LNG exports. Indeed, Mr Speaker, we are now the highest exporter of LNG
Just got to say to the
in
minister,
the world.
The minister at this point he has strayed off the question because the question was about Australia. It didn't have that global component. So the Treasurer will cease interjecting.
But, Mr Speaker, what we will do in reducing emissions and meeting our international obligations is to ensure we keep a strong economy. We will not trash the economy, as those opposite proposed to do in the policies they took to the last election.
The member for Ryan has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question today is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister kindly outline to the House how the government is getting on with the job of delivering its plan to keep Australia safe and secure?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ryan for his question. Can I congratulate him not only on his election to this place but also his excellent major speech that he
Just
gave
say to the Prime Minister
in the Parliament.
We can't hear him at the moment because he had his back turned to the microphone. So.
I'm happy to start again, Mr
Yeah,
Speaker,
no
if
problem.
you like. I was simply congratulating the member for Ryan, Mr Speaker, on his excellent first speech to the Parliament, his maiden speech yesterday, and I congratulate him on his election to this place. Our government is on the side of all of those who want to have a stronger Australia, a stronger economy, stronger national security, a more secure environment into the future, a secure region. Our government is on the side of those who always want to see Australia strengthened by the policies that are taken into this place. And we are securing a stronger economy for Australia. 296,000 jobs created in the last 12 months, 80% of those full-time jobs. You know how well the economy's going. You look at how many people are getting jobs, Mr Speaker, and our jobs growth over the last 12 months, 2.6%. Above the 2% we even put in the budget estimate, Mr Speaker, and that shows an economy that is creating jobs. We also have an economy, as a result of our economic plan, that is delivering comprehensive tax relief, not just today, but ensuring Australians can keep more of what we earn, because we on this side of the House believe that Australians should keep more of what they earn, and that shouldn't be taken away from them, and the decisions about how they spend their own money. And we all saw the circus from the opposition when they sought to oppose our tax relief, not just now but into the future, Mr Speaker, and they worked against us. They worked against the government to deliver tax relief, $100 billion in infrastructure investment, energy security plan that delivers reliability, that lowers more affordable energy and increased supply and a better deal for energy consumers, securing our environment plan, Mr Speaker, which means that we are meeting our emissions reductions targets, not just meeting them, Mr Speaker, but we are smashing them when it comes to the Kyoto 2020 targets, inheriting a massive deficit from the Labor Party, not just on the fiscal books but on the emissions reduction books, where we had to turn around 1 million tonnes in abatement over the course of our efforts while we have been in That's what we've done, Mr Speaker. And with water and with soils and native vegetation management, Mr Speaker, we are listening to the farmers who are the best environmentalists in this country, Mr Speaker, and backing them in on how they will manage our environment into the future. And we're protecting our national security, whether it's in our defence forces, in the Pacific, standing up against the farmers, for the farmers who are being invaded, Mr Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition's agricultural spokesperson already speaking against the protection for those farmers earlier this morning, and will stand up against terrorists every single time.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Member for Hindmarsh.
Sorry.
Mr Speaker, after the demise of the electorate of Port Adelaide, my question is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Did Australia's annual total carbon emissions rise in the year to December 2018?
The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. As I said, we are in our 28th year of economic growth, and the emissions per capita are the lowest at the lowest level in 29 years. Now, from year to year, emissions bump around. We inherited from you opposite a 700 million tonne deficit, But there is no doubt, Mr Speaker, that there was upward pressure in recent years on emissions driven by growth in LNG. And that growth in LNG—
I'm just going to ask the Minister to pause for a second. No, just pause for a second. Obviously, as I've said, when a question is very tight without a preamble, that makes the subject area much narrower. And I'm just going to say, for the guidance of members, obviously those answering ministers need to be directly relevant to the question asked when that doesn't have when it has a number of components, the answer can be very broad. Where it's a very tight question, things are much narrower, so the minister needs to be on the policy topic. So equally, questions can't demand yes/no answers. They can't, but what the minister can't do is stray beyond the question. So it's up to the minister to bring himself to the substance of the question or wind up the answer. No, I don't need any interjections.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And as I said, we're at the lowest levels of emissions per person in 29 years, and they've been falling year on year. And it's true, from year to year, they bump up and down. And in the last year, there's no doubt, there is no doubt that LNG exports have had an impact on our emissions. There's no doubt about that, Mr Speaker. But let's talk about that, because in the last year, Mr Speaker, our LNG exports reduced global emissions by up to 26% of our total emissions, Mr Speaker, because when you sell LNG up into China and Korea and Asia, even though we wear the increased emissions from the extraction of that LNG, we see a reduction in global emissions, Mr Speaker.
To resume his seat. Has the minister concluded his answer? The minister's concluded his answer. The member for Herbert.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the Morrison government's tax cuts will secure Australia's economic future by providing comprehensive tax relief to families and small businesses in my electorate of Herbert? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternate policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Herbert for his question. And he has served with great distinction on the battlefield on behalf of our country, and he brings those qualities to the parliament. I had the great pleasure to join the member for Herbert in his electorate last week, meeting with farmers, graziers, small business owners. Some of the 70,549 taxpayers in the electorate of Herbert that will get a tax cut as a result of the Coalition's legislation that passed this parliament, Mr Speaker. And 13,265 small businesses will be able to access the instant asset write-off, which was extended in the budget to $30,000 and for companies with a turnover of up to $50 million, Mr Speaker. And I can inform the House that as of today, 3.2 million Australians have lodged their tax return for the 18-19 year. That's nearly a 25% increase on the same period last year. And the tax office has seen over $3 billion in refunds make its way to Australian taxpayers' pockets, money to be spent at local businesses supporting Australian jobs, Mr Speaker. And the changes we have made to the tax system are substantial. What we have done is we have increased the thresholds. For the 19-cent rate, we've increased the threshold from $37,000 to $45,000. And we have lowered the rate. We have lowered the rate, the 32.5-cent rate, down to 30 cents, Mr Speaker. And we have abolished the bracket. A whole tax bracket, the 37 cents in the dollar bracket, has been abolished. So from between $45,000 and $200,000, you will pay a marginal rate of tax of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. That is tackling bracket creep, Mr Speaker.
Yeah.
So if you're on average full-time earnings, you can get a promotion, you can get a wage increase, but you won't get a higher marginal rate of tax, Mr Speaker. Now, we passed that legislation against the Labor Party's wishes, Mr Speaker, against the Labor Party's wishes, because they were not in favour of tax cuts. Now, would you believe, last night in this chamber at about 9 o'clock, the Leader of the Opposition amazingly said the following. He said, you've got some tax cuts through, but there's been no tax reform, Mr Speaker. No tax reform. Well, we've abolished a whole bracket, Mr Speaker. Earth to elbow, Mr Speaker. We've abolished a whole bracket.
The Treasurer will refer to members by their...
To the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. We've abolished a whole tax bracket. But what the Leader of the Opposition has confirmed is that his understanding The Labor Party's understanding of tax reform is $387 billion of higher taxes. Only the Coalition can be trusted to lower the Australian people's taxes.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Did Australia's annual total carbon emissions rise in the year to December 2017?
The minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm delighted to take these questions from you because during the election campaign you weren't able to answer a single question on the costs and impacts of your energy policies, Mr Speaker. Not a single question. Now, Mr Speaker, we have seen, again in the last year, a reduction in emissions per capita, in emissions intensity and in the electricity sector. And it's true, at the absolute level, there was a small increase in the last 12 months. That was driven entirely, Mr Speaker, by a growth in LNG exports, and that growth in LNG
exports will just resume his seat for a second. Has the minister concluded his answer? The member for Kennedy.
PM, for 200, probably 20,000 years, drought has scourged our land. Would not the super-reliable streams north of the Tennant Creek-Isa Mackay line provide 20 Hewendens? Your Hewenden HIPCO irrigation grazing model is the only answer to drought-growing grass. And wouldn't this make you the modern-day Moses? But may not evil tyrant process turn El Banisi into Tutankhamun?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Kennedy for his question. He must have been sitting in the back stalls of my church on Sunday because the pastor was actually talking about Moses on the weekend. So you may have been there in the back stalls. You're welcome any time, as any members are. Mr Speaker, I want to thank the member for Kennedy for this question, and I want to thank him for his strong advocacy of the Hewenden irrigation scheme. And together we have worked to ensure that we've committed $180 million from the National Water Infrastructure Development Fund to build the Hewenden irrigation scheme. So far, we know that that could capture and manage up to 500,000 megalitres of water. And this will grow primary production in the region significantly, ensure the best possible management of what you rightly describe as the scarce water resource. Most recently, I met with the Queensland Premier about this on the 12th of July, and in that meeting there was strong support indicated in that meeting, but I am concerned that other messages are being communicated by the Queensland Government to the proponents of that project, and I'll be seeking a clarity from the Queensland Government that whether they share our commitment to this project to see that it proceeds. We have already provided $2 million from the Community Development Grants Program for the feasibility study. $900,000 in funding has already been provided to the Hewenden Irrigation Project, or HITCO as it's known, to conduct that work. It's currently on track to deliver their second major project milestone by early August, and the final milestone due to be completed by early 2020. Now, I know that the member, like myself, is frustrated by the time taken to get a lot of this done, and I want to assure him that our government remains as committed to this project as when we first discussed it, and to break through the bureaucracy and the delays that have too long delayed these important projects. It's part of a broader set of work that we are doing to build water infrastructure in this country. And I remind the House what that includes, which I'm sure the Deputy Prime Minister would also. There's $155 million worth of construction already underway on the North Adelaide irrigation scheme in South Australia. There's $80 million underway in the South Western London pipeline in Victoria. There is $60 million in the McAllister Irrigation District modernisation in Victoria. There is money also going into the Sunraysia modernisation project phase 2 in Victoria. There's $51 million in the Scottsdale irrigation scheme in Tasmania. There's $8 million in the Mareeba Dimbula water supply scheme in northern Queensland, $12 million in the Nakoa Mackenzie water supply scheme in northern Queensland. There's $352 million going into the Rookwood Weir in Queensland, and the preliminary work on that has commenced, and $396 million going into the Mealup Wellington project in Western Australia. We're very serious about pursuing these programs. They're happening now, and our government is committed to the national water grid and delivering the water infrastructure that Australia needs.
The member for Nichols.
Speaker, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the government is working to secure Australia's water future by continuing to invest in water infrastructure and establishing the national water grid?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Nichols for his question. It's all about water in question time today, as it should be, because water is our most precious resource. And the Liberals and Nationals know the key to unlocking the potential of our regions is add water. Add water, store it when it falls, use it when it's dry, and that's why we're establishing the National Water Grid, Mr Speaker, a new authority to take a visionary approach to water security right across this nation. It's time to take out of the debate the petty politics, the obfuscation, the delay, the bureaucracy, the parochialism, and get on with building water infrastructure, and that's what we're doing. We just heard the Prime Minister. We're getting on with building the water infrastructure that we need, that we want, and most of all we deserve. As I've said before, national leadership is needed, and that's what we're doing. We're delivering. Transformational change is what is required. The National Water Grid will bring together the best science and scientists, the best people, particularly local stakeholder engagement. We want that local input to provide strategic advice on planning, on project management, on delivery for water infrastructure, water security. Dams. We've already done much in this regard. We just heard the Prime Minister outline a number of projects. Not an exhaustive list by any means. There's even more than what the Prime Minister said. But we've already been busy replumbing and helping to further drought-proof the regions. That's what's needed. The Midiamo water supply project in the member for Nichols electorate, as well as the member for Mallee's electorate. She's going to give a great inaugural speech in this place very soon during this sitting period, Mr Speaker. $14.5 million announced on the 11th of April. That's going to, as the member for Nichols and Mallee would know, open up an additional 80,000 hectares of irrigated agriculture, farmland potential, unlocking the potential of those great Victorian regions. It's going to benefit, to boost about 200 farms, and they know how significant that is. Southwest of Echuca, north of Bendigo, it's going to be an incredible investment by this government. It's going to be a good investment. It's going to unlock the potential of that region. And don't take my word for it. Let's hear from what Midiamo Pipeline Committee Chair Neil Allen said. He said it means we will have clean, fresh water 24 hours a day. We'll no longer have to rely on channel-filled dams. And Mr Allen knows full well the benefits to the farmers, for stock, for domestic purposes. This is fantastic news, and I know that the member for Maranoa, the Minister for Water Resources, I know how he wants us to get on board with the Emu Swamp Dam near Stanthorpe in the Granite Belt. That's a significant project. I hope the Queensland Government gets on board with that. The irrigators there have put $23.4 million down. We've put $42 million down. We want that project off the ground.
Concluded. The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Did Australia's annual total carbon emissions rise in the year to December 2016?
The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, as I say, I'm delighted to take questions from the member for Port Adelaide, because he absolutely refused to answer any questions on his policy during the election campaign, and the member for Maribyrnong wasn't much better, Mr Speaker, wasn't much better. I have already answered this question, Mr Speaker, in the previous answer. But what I can tell you is that in 2013,
no, the Minister. just say to the minister again, the question was very specific, and it referred to a particular year. So I'll hear the minister, but he's got to be mindful that he's got to be directly relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2013, the Climate Change Authority forecast that the emissions in 2018 would be around 680 million tonnes, and in fact, they are at 534 million tonnes now. Mr. Speaker, it's worthy of explanation as to what's happened.
Just before I call the Leader of the Opposition, I wanted to hear the minister, and I was worried he was straying. I think the point if the second Deputy Speaker thinks it's appropriate, of all the people in this chamber, to interject on me, you're going to spend a lot of time out of the chamber in this parliament. Now, I've got to say, you're not going to wave your hands. People get thrown out under 94A, and I'm saying to the second Deputy Speaker, you've got special responsibilities in that role. I regret I have to say that, but I feel I've got no choice anymore. I'll hear the Leader of the Opposition on the point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have asked very specific questions today about whether total carbon emissions have got up. This question is about 2016. We're previously asked about 2017 and 2018. We're trying to keep it pretty tight. Can't be tighter than this. We expect an answer. They either are going up or they're going down.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. It is a very tight question. That's why I wanted to make that point to the minister. The question, he needs to relate his material to 2016. I'm afraid. I'll hear from the Leader of the House. No, look, to members on my left, we're not going to have a situation where I patiently listen to points of order from your side, and then somehow you're going to have some sort of chorus volume that means I shouldn't listen to them from the other side. The Leader of the House is entitled to the call, and he has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And questions with respect to an increase have to be off a base. The base wasn't stipulated in the question. So looking at estimates of that year must be relevant to the answer.
You know, I'm going to keep hearing the minister on this, and that way I can judge how relevant he is. On the point of order.
Thank you, Speaker.
Yes, the
annual increase means December 31 to December 31. It's pretty tight. 2016. Every year's the same. 365 days, except for every 4 years there's an extra day.
Leader of the Opposition, you don't get an extra. Members on both sides, I'm going to hear the minister, and I'm going to judge on whether he's being relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, emissions in that year were 100 million tonnes, over 100 million tonnes, below what was forecast by the Climate Change Authority in 2013. Now, it is true, Mr. Speaker, from year to year and quarter to quarter, emissions go up and down. That's what happens, Mr. Speaker. But let me tell you something. When we take account of the LNG record LNG
I'm just going to ask the
exports.
minister to resume his seat. Thank you. We're going to the next question. The member for Dawson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the minister update the House on steps the Morrison government is taking to protect and secure our natural environment, including improving soil health for our agricultural sector?
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the member for Dawson for his question and for his ongoing outstanding advocacy for the farmers in his electorate. I know that in March this year he was in Mackay with Paul Scambry, chair of the Queensland Cane Growers, and he was announcing a project about water quality and the Great Barrier Reef. But we can't do it without our farmers. We can't do it without our magnificent sugarcane farmers in the member for Dawson's electorate, in the member for Capricornia's electorate, in the envoy for the Great Barrier Reef's electorate, and so on. This is an example, Mr. Speaker, of farmers getting on with the job, because the natural environment is inextricably linked with farming, forestry and fishing. We don't see agriculture and the environment at opposite ends of the spectrum at all. We know that our farmers, many of them represented by people on this side of the House, look after over 60% of Australia's landmass. So we can talk about policies, and we do, but we can't do it without our farmers. And there's no better example than the land care movement, which celebrated 30 years just recently. And as someone who was a family farmer myself for 17 years, secretary of my local land care movement, I learned so much from the wisdom of those land managers around us. Some of them are Indigenous Australians who've been managing this land longer than the farmers. But the point that the Environment Portfolio would like to emphasise is that it and agriculture are not in competition. We are not in opposition. We are working together. We know that between us we can help with one of the key environmental and agricultural outcomes, which is healthy soils. And I was absolutely delighted to see that Major General Michael Jeffrey has been reappointed as the National Soils Advocate. No one who listens to Michael Jeffrey could not but be a convert, if you weren't already, to the cause of healthy soils. And he spoke at the National Drought Summit, and he was outstanding. And I'm delighted, Prime Minister, that his term has been extended. In fact, his office has been embedded ongoing into this government. Healthy soils sequester carbon, they support life, they support our precious biodiversity. They make a difference, and in a continent with fragile soils, as Australia is, the more we can work to produce those healthy soils, the better. And we have done. We've continued $1.1 billion from the last budget to the next phase of the National Land Care Program, providing funding to June 2023. And we will keep on this case the benefits from this project. I'm delighted the Minister for Water Resources and Drought Preparedness now, through his strong representation of farmers, has $100 million to disperse all about drought preparedness, to build that resilience into our farmers, to support our landscape and to love and look after our environment.
The member for Richmond.
My question is to the Minister for Energy. Does he rule out a nuclear power station being built in northern New South Wales or on the Gold Coast?
The Minister for Energy. Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And as I say, I'm delighted to be receiving questions from those opposite today, because during the election campaign they steadfastly refused to answer questions about their real plan, which was to establish a carbon tax, double the price of electricity and triple the price of gas for all Australians, Mr Speaker, for all Australians. That's what they intended to do, and that's why the member for Maribyrnong and the member for Port Adelaide steadfastly refused to answer questions on energy policy throughout the campaign. Now, Mr Speaker,
the member for Solomon will leave under 94A.
Mr Speaker, the government's priority is on getting energy prices down for all Australians, hard-working households and small businesses, while we keep the lights on, and we've steadfastly said that we will focus on outcomes, not the fuel source.
I'm just going to say to the minister, he's entitled to a preamble, but that time's coming to a close. We're almost a minute into the answer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. As I say, we're not focused on the fuel source, we're focused on the outcome, and we currently have a moratorium on nuclear power generation in Australia, and the government has no plans to change that. Now, we always approach these things with an open mind, but we do not have We do not have a plan to change the moratorium. It's as simple as that. That's the position, Mr Speaker. But I tell you what we will do. We will steadfastly focus on affordable, reliable energy for all Australians, and we will not put in place policies that are going to double the price of electricity and triple the price of gas, as those opposite proposed at the last election.
Members on my left, the member for Isaacs, and I call the member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the steps the government is taking to strengthen Australia's national security measures? How might different approaches put Australians at risk?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for Barara, and I thank all of those members across the parliament, of course, who support our agencies, who work day and night to keep Australians safe. It is the fact, Mr Speaker, that we have, like any Western democracy, faced a significant threat, and we still do today, we will do for all of our lifetime, in terms of those people who would seek to do us harm. We've seen some terribly tragic events in the United States, across Southeast Asia, across Europe, and we are not immune in this country. And I want to make the point today that we have people, Australian citizens, people who have been born in our country, people who have been naturalised, who have gone off to fight in Syria and in Iraq and would seek to come back to cause serious damage, carnage and death in our country. And so the support that we've provided to our national agencies, not only through financial support, but through the ways in which in this parliament we've been able to pass 17 tranches of significant pieces of legislation to support those agencies. And this government went to the election, as we go to every election, saying to the Australian people, we will do everything within our power to keep Australians safe. We made that promise at the last election. We will live it during the course of this term of government and for many years beyond. We do it, Mr Speaker, because we have had 7 attacks in our country. We've had 16 major disruptions in relation to imminent attacks that had been planned in our country since September of 2014. We know that 73 people have been convicted of terrorism-related offences since 2001, and we know that 98 people have been charged as a result of counter-terrorism operations since 2014. And that is why, Mr Speaker, the government now is asking for the support of this parliament to introduce legislation which has been used in the United Kingdom to temporarily exclude those people who we believe would come to our country to cause death and carnage in Australia. And the parliament deserves to support this legislation because the Australian people deserve that support. Mr Speaker, that's the reality. That's the reality, Mr Speaker. And those opposite who are opposed to this legislation should be exposed, including the member for Isaac, Mr Speaker, who, when he was Attorney-General, refused to introduce any legislation to support our national security agencies. That's the reality, Mr Speaker. Now, this government will support our agencies because of the threat that exists this very day, Mr Speaker, and we will work with the crossbenchers. We will work with whoever is in this parliament to support this legislation into fruition, because we are absolutely determined to deal with this threat. And I want to say to all Australians, we are not immune from what we've seen overseas, and this government will continue to support ASIO, the Federal Police, our state policing agencies, all of those who are involved in keeping Australians safe.
You don't. That's the problem.
The member for Isaacs, and the minister and the member for Isaacs will cease interjecting. We're going to the next question. Otherwise, I will facilitate a conversation for them in another location. The member for Shortland has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy. Is the government working on a policy proposed by the member for New England where, and I quote, "If you can see the nuclear reactor from your house, your power is for free. If you are within 50 kilometres of a reactor, you get the power for half price"?
The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The answer to that is no.
The member for Canning. Member for Canning has
Thank
the
you,
call.
Mr Speaker.
Members on my left. Member for Canning.
My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney update the House on how the government is ensuring Australian laws protect the Australian community from foreign fighters and terrorists, and how do alternate approaches compare?
The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And the Minister for Home Affairs has already pointed out how critical and necessary this bill before the House is, the Temporary Exclusion Order Bill. What our agencies tell us, Mr Speaker, is that the many Australians who have fought or otherwise supported Islamic extremist groups in Syria and Iraq are self-evidently radicalised, skilled in terror techniques and very, very dangerous people. They present a serious national security challenge that needs solving. And that's why, Mr Speaker, I was astonished at what was said by the member for Cowan this morning in the debate for this bill, the Temporary Exclusion Orders Bill, when she said, and using her words, this was not effective and not impactful legislation. Now this is yep was the answer. Yep was
member
the interjection.
Member for Cowan will not
From
interject.
the member for Cowan. She stands by those words, and why would she not? Because she said them clearly, that this is not effective and not impactful legislation. Now, Mr Speaker, members, this is not a technical argument about whether an amendment from a committee was adopted in part or full. This is a fulsome rejection of the critical importance of this bill. And what was even more astonishing, Mr Speaker, was the reason given as to why this bill is not effective or impactful.
The minister will just pause for a second. The member for Cowan cannot interject. If the member for Cowan feels that in some way what's being said is not representative of what she said, there are other forms of the House where she can address it. But as frustrated as she is, she cannot do that in question time by repeatedly interjecting. The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The reasons given by the member for Cowan as to why this was not effective or impactful legislation are, again, in her words, that the people we're trying to control are migratory in nature and they will go from one theatre of war to another theatre of war. Mr Speaker, the fact that they are migratory is the point of this legislation. And this government has as its first priority the protection of the Australian people, and the one place as an absolute priority we will invest every effort and every resource to prevent migratory extremists turning into a theatre of war is Australia, Mr Speaker. That is why this legislation is necessary. And, Mr Speaker, compare those words that it is not effective or impactful legislation to this submission from our agencies. Australia's previous experience with Australians returning from conflict zones demonstrates the threat they can pose. Of the 30 Australians who fought or trained with extremist groups in conflict zones between 1990 and 2010, including Pakistan and Afghanistan, 25 returned, 8 were convicted of terrorist offence. The Counter-Terrorism Commonwealth Coordinator put it very simply when she said the risk is that they could come back into Australia and conduct a terrorist attack on our soil and kill or injure Australians. This is some of the most impactful and effective and critical necessary legislation this parliament will see in this term. And the description by it from the member for Cowan elucidates precisely what they think over there on that side.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. I refer to the Minister's appointment to administer the Department of Environment and Energy, including all matters and legislation allocated to the department in the Administrative Arrangements Order made on 29 May. Can the Minister confirm a company in which he has an interest, Jam Land Proprietary Limited, is now being investigated by his own department in relation to the alleged illegal land clearing of critically endangered grasslands?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you for the question. I've been very clear about this in public. I have no association and I have remained arm's-length at all times from the company Jam Land. In 2017, I received a briefing from departmental officials on technical aspects of a revised listing under the EPBC Act, and I make absolutely no apology for seeking and receiving a briefing on policies that seriously impact farmers in my electorate, because I care about farmers in my electorate. I care about farmers in my electorate, and it's what the people of Hume expect from me as their local member. The most remarkable fact, Mr Speaker, is that other affected members, such as the member for Eden Monero, didn't do the same, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I will always stand up for the people of my electorate. I will do the right thing by them at every point in time.
The member for Fisher.
Mr Speaker, my question goes to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on the importance of a strong and consistent approach to securing Australia's borders, and is the Minister aware of any risks associated with alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for Fisher for his question. Obviously, the government has been strong and consistent on border protection for a number of years, and necessarily so, Mr Speaker, because when we came into government in 2013, there was a disaster. A disaster because the Labor Party had given up sovereignty of this country and allowed 50,000 people to arrive on 800 boats, and 1,200 people, Mr Speaker, tragically had drowned at sea. Now, during the election, we said that if Labor was elected, the boats would restart. Now, people thought at the time, well, of course they would say that. The reality, Mr Speaker, is that boats had already been put on the water during the election campaign in anticipation of the member for Maribyrnong, remember him, becoming Prime Minister of this country. That's the reality, Mr Speaker. A vessel with 41 people on board headed our way from Sri Lanka, almost went to the bottom of the ocean, and fortunately those people were saved and returned back to Sri Lanka. There was another vessel, Mr Speaker, of 20 people on board that we were able to intercept and return those 20 people back. Those people, no doubt, would have landed here under the Labor Party. Now, Mr Speaker, there is an amazing difference of approach on this policy between our side of this chamber compared to the other side. But, Mr Speaker, it's hard to know, because I am asked about alternative approaches, what the position of the Labor Party is today. Because you might remember in the last parliament it was very hard to know what Labor stood for because their policy chopped and changed. You remember our old friend, the member for Blair? Now, he was working up, Mr Speaker, he was a champion of the side. He was working up over a 3-year period to ask a question on boats, but he never got there, Mr Speaker. And he is a man, Mr Speaker, who has been cut down in his prime, and it's sorry to watch, Mr Speaker. He was building up to a question. There's no doubt about it, Mr Speaker. No doubt about it. The only problem is he didn't know what question to ask, Mr Speaker, because the Labor Party's been in favour of turnbacks. They've been opposed to turnbacks. They've been in favour of offshore processing. They've been against offshore processing. They've been in favour of temporary protection visas. They, of course, are opposed to temporary protection visas. All of that which has worked to stop the boats, to make sure that we can get kids out of detention, to make sure that we don't have people drowning at sea, the Labor Party still this very day stands opposed to every one of those measures. And, Mr Speaker, I can inform the House that we have dealt with a vessel on water in recent days, and we have returned that vessel, which contained 5 male Sri Lankans, back to Sri Lanka, and I put praise on all of those officers who have been involved in that operation.
Has concluded. The member for Griffith.
My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. In the meetings he referred to in the previous answer with officials from the department, did he disclose his interest in land impacted by the listing of critically endangered grasslands in the Monero region, or in a compliance investigation into land clearing in that region?
The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I have always disclosed my interests. I have always disclosed my interests, and I've been very clear about those interests. Now, in 2017, before I was the minister in this role, as I answered in the previous question, I received a briefing from departmental officials on technical aspects of a revised listing under the EPPC Act. And the reason is that those changes impacted the farmers in my electorate. I care about the farmers in my electorate. I care about the farmers in my electorate. I wanted to see that drought fund go through yesterday, despite the protestations from those opposite, unlike the member for Eden Monero, who takes no interest in the farmers in his electorate. Mr Speaker, the Department of Environment has confirmed that the briefing did not discuss compliance action. They have confirmed that. When raised in Senate estimates in April 2019, the Secretary of the Department of the Environment said, "I can be very clear that Mr Taylor has never raised the issue with me."
The member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Assistant Defence Minister and the Minister for International Development and the Pacific. In light of the historic state visit by Papua New Guinea's Prime Minister James Marape and his senior ministers this week, will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is partnering with Papua New Guinea through the Pacific Step Up to address shared challenges and support a stable, secure and prosperous region?
I call the Minister for International Development.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the member for Leichhardt, the Special Envoy for the Reef, for his question. I want to note his long-standing commitment to Australia's relationship with PNG, the esteem with which is held by PNG in our parliament. Mr Speaker, the government warmly welcomes Prime Minister James Marape's visit here to Australia, his historic visit. Australia has no closer friend than Papua New Guinea. This is underscored by the fact that the first visit Prime Minister Marape made here was to Australia. It's also the first official visit by a head of government in the re-elected Morrison government, Mr Speaker. Prime Ministers Morrison and Marape met yesterday for the inaugural Leaders' Dialogue, which I was pleased to join with many of our colleagues here from both Australia and PNG. This was a significant delegation, and I want to note that now we'll have an important annual leadership dialogue every single year with Papua New Guinea. Vitally, Prime Minister Morrison and Marape announced that we're elevating the bilateral relationship to a comprehensive strategic and economic partnership, which is an important development for this House to note. This new elevated partnership will encompass economic aspects and joint prosperity. It will tackle shared security challenges together, and it will build on our personal connections, such as our ties through sporting programs, our cultural links and our church relationships. I want to thank the opposition for their support for Prime Minister Morrison and Marape's initiative. Our parliament is united on this important relationship. Mr Speaker, Australia and PNG are true friends. Most importantly, as our Prime Minister says, we are family. I want to particularly note that today is Papua New Guinean Remembrance Day. It's a good day for us to reflect on our shared history that encompasses ties that were deepened through the trials of war. Papua New Guinea was the Tobruk of the Pacific. The service of the PNG people in literally carrying our soldiers on their shoulders, defending their country, defending our country, will never be forgotten by this parliament or by our country. This long-term cooperation we have on security, on trade, investment and economic development will now enter a new phase. As we celebrate the 40 years of defence cooperation, Australia has committed a further $20 million to further strengthen our defence partnerships and ties. New initiatives will continue our joint work on PNG's Lombrom Naval Base, and we've agreed to continue to explore and extend opportunities for our security relationship, infrastructure development and information sharing. Mr Speaker, deepening the PNG-Australia economic relationship through joint infrastructure will continue to be a key priority of the Morrison government. It will enable prosperity, it will build the business relationship, it will mean ongoing deepening of our ties. But, Mr Speaker, I also want to particularly note the warmth of the relationship that we had with PNG. I'll quote Prime Minister Marape when he referred to all of us as PNG's brothers and sisters. For our Prime Ministers, for us, for our Parliament, PNG's prosperity is our prosperity. Their success is our success. That's why the Pacific Step-Up is going to continue to be one of the first priorities of the Morrison government.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Was a compliance officer from the Department of Environment present at the meeting referred to in his previous answer with departmental officials about the listing of critically endangered grasslands in the Monero region affecting land he part-owned?
The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, thank you, and thank you for the question. But look, this is a grubby smear from those opposite, one of many that have been made and were made during the election campaign, and I have been very clear on this. This was not a discussion about compliance action. It was a briefing from departmental officials on technical aspects of a revised listing under the EPBC Act. And the Secretary of the Department has made very clear, and I quote, "I can be very clear that Minister Taylor has never raised the issue." This is the point. And I make no apology, though, Mr Speaker. I make no apology for acting in the interests of the farmers in my electorate. And it's about time that those opposite, stood up for the farmers in their electorates.
The member for Eden Monero will cease interjecting. Was this a point of order? Has the minister concluded? The minister's concluded. I call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is also to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister update the House on how the government is securing our nation by ensuring reliable energy supply and keeping the lights on for Australian households and businesses? And is the minister aware of any alternate approaches?
The Minister for Energy has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question, because she is absolutely focused on the interests of her constituents, including her farmers, her hard-working small businesses, the families and the industry that provides so many of those crucial jobs to the people of Robertson. Now, she is focused on a fair deal for energy, as are we. Mr Speaker, and a fair deal for energy can be achieved delivering a strong economy whilst we reach our international emissions obligations, and we'll achieve those on the back of a record $25 billion of renewable energy investment in the pipeline right now. We are leading the world per capita, double the next country in the world. Our challenge now, Mr Speaker, our challenge is to ensure that we have enough reliable generation in the system to keep the lights on and to keep power affordable to all Australians. And that's why, Mr Speaker, from July 1, we introduced the retailer reliability obligation, which requires the energy companies to guarantee supply to meet the needs of their customers 3 years ahead of time. 3 years ahead of time. It's also why we've created a program to underwrite new reliable generation into the market, Mr Speaker, to push power prices down and to keep the lights on. Now, Mr Speaker, it's simply not enough to have power when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. We need it 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. And that's why we're sharply focused on keeping our existing coal and gas generation in the market running at full tilt. But there are alternative approaches, Mr Speaker. There are alternative approaches. And if you take Victoria, for example, where the state Labor government has simply trashed their grid, forcing reliable energy generation out of their grid through their ideological focus on reckless targets, Mr Speaker. That has already led to blackouts last January, when we saw 200,000 businesses in Victoria lose their lights, 200,000 businesses and households lose their power. Yet the state Labor government has done nothing to improve the reliability of their grid since then. Now, here in this place, Labor has committed to roll out that same approach across the country with their reckless targets that they took to the last election. Worse still, Mr Speaker, during that campaign, those opposite failed to answer the most basic questions about the costs and the impacts of their policies, whilst independent modelling told us that those policies would double the price of electricity and triple the price of gas, Mr Speaker. Only the Liberal National Government can be trusted to deliver a strong economy and a fair deal on energy.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. I refer to the minister's previous answer and I ask again, was a compliance officer present at the meeting?
Simple question. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I have dealt with this in the previous question. This was not a discussion. This was not a discussion about a compliance action. It was a discussion. Let's be clear. The discussion was about the impact of a revised listing on farmers in my electorate. And there were two affected electorates, Mr Speaker. My electorate and my neighbour's electorate. I care about the farmers in my electorate. I will always act in their interest because that is my job.
The member for Griffith.
My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, no one else. The member for Griffith can wait. No one else jumped. There's no. I'm not going to start randomly asking people to jump for a question. No one else jumped. The call alternates. I look to the government side, I look to the opposition side, and one person jumped, and I've called the member for Griffith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Member for Griffith. Members on my left are now delaying the member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker.
The member for Griffith will begin her question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. I refer to his previous answer. When seeking the assistance of the Treasurer to arrange a meeting with departmental officials about critically endangered grasslands in the Monero region, did he disclose his personal interest in the matter?
The minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I have always disclosed my personal interests, any interest that may have an impact on my role. I've been clear about that. That's my job, and I do it all the time. Now, as I said, at this meeting that the member opposite refers to, I received a briefing from departmental officials on technical aspects of this revised listing. But I would point out that an independent review since then by Wendy Craig, released only about a month ago, found that there have been major deficiencies in how the Act is understood and how, in particular, farmers are dealt with. And I'm pleased that this review specifically identified the very issues that I have previously raised and that were raised in this meeting, Mr Speaker, and that's because I will always act in the interests of farmers. Perhaps those opposite could learn a little bit from that.
The member for Denison. Sorry, Clark. Apologies.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Minister, Hobart City Council yesterday voted in support of pill testing at major events and festivals. Now, we know pill testing saves lives, and health experts agree a harm minimisation approach is the only sensible response to illicit drug use. Yet the Tasmanian government is clinging to an ideological opposition to harm minimisation and pill testing in particular, and refuses to back the council's position. Minister, while some like the ACT government have taken a lead on this, governments like Tasmania's have shown they simply don't understand the issue. So will you, as Health Minister, put the issue of pill testing on the COAG Health Council agenda?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Much, Mr Speaker, and the answer is no. Yesterday, I respectfully disagreed with the member for Clark on the proposition he took. Today, I will respectfully but categorically disagree with the member. What he has proposed is, I believe, a dangerous and unfounded course of action. Let me say this, that whether it is tested or not, MDMA, ice, certain opioids such as fentanyl can be deadly in their purest forms. These are drugs which are illegal for a reason. They are drugs because they can kill. They are drugs because the nature of the response may not be known in an individual case. At the very moment that this parliament, that this government and the entire nation is seeking to deal with some of the challenges both of amphetamines and of opioids, the idea that we would be condoning, encouraging and supporting the expansion of their consumption is, to my mind, utterly unthinkable. And so this is not a position which the Australian government will be adopting. It is a position which the Australian government will be opposing. We have the full support that we can possibly give for the position of the Tasmanian government. And so the reason we do this is because we want to save lives and protect lives. We know that not only might there be flaws in the pill testing approach, but even if it makes it clear that it's a pure form of MDMA, a pure form of ice, a pure form of fentanyl, that is not going to save a person. They may take an overdose, or even if they take what they believe is an appropriate dose, that can be enough to take their lives. That's why these drugs are dangerous, that's why these drugs are illicit, and that's why we will not be adopting the approach which the member, I believe, foolishly and dangerously has advocated.
The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is also for the Minister for Health. Mental health and suicide prevention is one of the main issues that's raised with me by parents and young people. Can the minister outline what actions the government is taking to provide support and security to those at risk of suicide?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Bass, who was courageous and upfront in her first speech about the challenges which she, like so many in this chamber and every other room in Australia, have faced during the course of her and our lives. Whether it's individually or whether it's within our families, our friendship groups, our community groups or our workplaces, we know that mental health is a challenge that will affect 4 million Australians in any one year, that suicide will sadly take over 3,100 Australians on the last year of full figures which are available to the Australian government. And so this is something of profound importance, and we're taking steps locally, nationally and long-term. In terms of the local, during the course of the election campaign, with the advocacy of both the members for Bass and for Braddon, we were able to announce an adult mental health centre for northern Tasmania. That will be located in Launceston in the member for Basildone electorate. And this is something which has been a personal passion and a personal advocacy campaign, and to have achieved so much so quickly is a real measure of the integrity of spirit that you bring to the place. At the national level, one of the critical things in dealing with suicide is recovery and rehabilitation after somebody leaves hospital. We know that the chances of somebody again attempting and completing suicide after they have been discharged from hospital, having been admitted for suicidality, for attempted suicide, is the highest in the country of all of the different ways of cutting the figures. And so that means, whilst this is terrible, we have one particular opportunity here, and that is we know the very individuals who are most at risk. And I want to commend and thank former Prime Minister Julia Gillard for her comments today and her work with Beyond Blue. We are working with Beyond Blue on their Wayback program. So we started with the leadership of Jeff Kennett. The baton was passed to Julia Gillard, and she's been magnificent. And we are supporting the Wayback program with a $37 million government initiative which will track the individuals. Firstly, in 25 groups, but we want to work with the states to spread it across every single patient who is ultimately discharged from hospital having faced the task of recovery from attempted suicide or suicidality. And then the Prime Minister himself personally appointed and announced only recently the wonderful Christine Morgan, formerly of the Butterfly Foundation but now of the National Mental Health Commission, as his personal envoy on national suicide prevention. And we want to work with Christine on a decade-long plan to help address this crisis, to deal with this crisis, and ultimately give every Australian a way back.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Why won't the minister tell the House whether or not a compliance officer was present at the meeting? The
Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, at the time, 2017, when I was in a previous role, I had no idea who was coming to that meeting. I didn't ask those people to come to a meeting. My understanding has been drawn to my attention since then that there was actually a compliance officer there. But let me tell you, it is very clear, Mr Speaker, that on that day I received a briefing from departmental officials on technical aspects of the revised listing under the EPBC Act. Now, this is a big deal for farmers, something that those opposite wouldn't understand. It affects the small businesses who farm in my electorate and all of those businesses that depend on them. It is my job as a local member to make sure they get a fair deal. Now, as I said in the previous answer, an independent review by Wendy Craig identified that there were serious issues that I'm pleased now that the government is acting on, which will ensure that farmers are better able to work with the EPBC Act and hopefully will reduce red tape for farmers who are the greatest custodians of our environment, Mr Speaker.
The member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister please advise the House about how the government is boosting exports and securing our industries and how this helps secure the Australian economy?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Groom for his question, because he, like all of the members on this side of the House, understands that boosting exports grows our economy and it creates jobs. It means that so many hard-working Australians can get ahead, including the many producers and the farmers in the members' electorate of Groom. Now, the Coalition is the party of small and medium enterprises. Yeah. We know that they are the engine room of Australia's economy. We know that for our economy to grow, to keep Australians secure in their economic growth, we need to be supporting our small and medium enterprises. Now, we also know that many of our small and medium enterprises are very time poor. They're very focused on working in their businesses,
making sure that they are doing whatever it takes to keep their businesses operating on a day-to-day basis. And because often they are so tied up working in their businesses, they don't have the opportunity to work on their businesses. Now, the coalition government is committed to doing all that we can to make sure that we are working with our small and medium enterprises and assisting them to grow export opportunities. And one very practical example of the way that they're doing that is through the $20 million Small and Medium Enterprise Export Hubs initiatives. Now, I was recently in Toowoomba with the member for Groom, where we announced that we would be establishing an export hub in that area. Now, that export hub will be opening. The Southern Queensland Innovation and Export Hub will be opening in Toowoomba later this month. Actually, next week it will be opening. But it's already working to help our local businesses to grow and to develop. Now, while we were there, we met with one of the fabulous local businesses there, a small and medium business, Jim's Jerky, and we heard from Emily Pullen, who said, and I quote, "One of the things that we really see as a business is Australian beef has an amazing reputation overseas, and we'd love to take that to another segment, which is snacking." Now, this is a business that is growing opportunities. It's taking Australian beef, it's developing a new snacking program, and it will be looking to export those. Now, we know that the Australian-made logo is so important. When we go into supermarkets and we see that, we know that it means quality. We have committed to an additional $5 million to promote globally the Australian-made logo, because we want everyone across the world, when they see that green and gold label, to go, "How good is Australia?"
The Prime Minister.
Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It being past 3:10, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and I would